I learned a long time ago that humiliation doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes dressed in pearls and perfume. Sometimes it smiles while holding a champagne glass. And sometimes it comes from the woman your son married. The morning of my grandson's engagement brunch, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror for nearly 20 minutes, trying to decide whether I looked too old for the navy blue dress. At 68, that becomes part of your thinking. Not whether something fits, whether people think you still deserve to be seen in it. I smoothed my hands over the fabric carefully. The dress had been hanging untouched in my closet since my husband Richard's memorial service 2 years earlier. I almost changed 3 times, but then I looked down at the pearl earrings resting in my palm. Richard bought them for me in 1987, after our first terrible year in business, back when we still ate frozen dinners because we couldn't afford restaurants. Back when we used to laugh over burnt coffee at midnight while trying to keep everything from collapsing. I put the earrings on, and for a second, I almost felt like myself again. Outside, the February air carried that sharp Connecticut cold that settles into your bones after 65. The valet line at Blackstone Country Club curved around the entrance fountain. Luxury SUVs, cashmere coats, young couples laughing too loudly. Everything polished, everything expensive. Everything designed to remind people exactly where they stood socially. I sat in my Buick for an extra moment before getting out. Something about the invitation had felt strange all week. Vanessa had barely spoken to me in months. Then suddenly she called personally to invite me to the brunch. Her voice had sounded overly sweet, like frosting hiding spoiled cake. "You should come, Diane," she'd said. "Family's important." Family. That word had started sounding different after Richard died. The valet opened my door gently. The second my shoes touched the pavement, he smiled. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore." I blinked, not because he recognized me, because almost nobody did anymore. "Good morning," I said softly. He reached for my coat with immediate respect, and I noticed something subtle shift nearby. 2 women standing near the entrance looked at me differently for half a second. Recognition, confusion, then it disappeared. I should have paid more attention to that moment, because Vanessa certainly did. I spotted her near the front terrace before she saw me. Tall, blonde, perfect posture. The kind of woman who always looked expensive, even in daylight. She wore cream-colored designer slacks and held a champagne flute like she'd practiced it in a mirror. My son Daniel stood beside her checking something on his phone. He looked tired, older than 52 should look. I started toward them slowly. Vanessa noticed me first, and immediately something in her smile tightened. Not enough for most people to see, but mothers notice things, especially mothers who've spent years being quietly pushed out of their own families. "Oh," she said, just that. "Oh," like she hadn't expected me to actually come. I kissed Daniel on the cheek first. He smelled like Richard's old cologne. That nearly broke me. "Hi, Mom," he said distractedly. Then Vanessa leaned in air kiss style without touching me and looked down at my coat, then my shoes, then my handbag. The inspection lasted maybe 2 seconds, but humiliation has a way of stretching time. "You made it," she said lightly. I smiled. Of course, I wouldn't miss Tyler's engagement brunch. Right. Another smile, thin this time. Behind her, I noticed 2 younger women whispering while glancing toward me. Vanessa turned slightly toward them, then back to me. And that's when she said it. "Oh, guest check-in is actually through the side entrance now." I stared at her. For a second, I honestly thought I misunderstood. "The side entrance?" I repeated. She nodded casually. "For staff and vendors." A tiny laugh escaped one of the women nearby. Tiny, but sharp. Vanessa tilted her head sympathetically. "I just didn't want you getting confused." Confused, that word. People use it differently around older women. It never just means confused. It means fragile, embarrassing, inconvenient. I felt heat cross slowly at my neck. Not anger yet. Something worse. Shame. And the terrifying part? Daniel heard her. He heard every word. But instead of correcting her, he looked away toward the golf course. That hurt more than Vanessa ever could. The country club buzzed with soft piano music and expensive conversations. Silver trays floated through the room, carrying mimosas and smoked salmon canapes. Everything smelled like fresh flowers and polished wood. And there I stood, feeling smaller than I had in years. But I smiled anyway, because women my age were raised to survive humiliation quietly, especially in public. "Oh," I said gently. "Thank you." Then I stepped aside like I actually believed her. Vanessa's friends exchanged glances. One of them smirked into her champagne glass. I started toward the side corridor, slowly, carefully. My chest felt tight. Not from illness, from memory, because this wasn't new. Not really. Humiliation inside families rarely begins with one cruel sentence. It begins in layers. A missed invitation. A joke everyone pretends is harmless. Grandchildren suddenly too busy to call. your birthday forgotten, your opinions interrupted, until one day, someone publicly mistakes your silence for weakness. Behind me, I heard Vanessa laughing again, bright, social, untouched. I kept walking. The hallway near the service entrance smelled faintly like bleach and coffee. A young employee carrying folded linens nearly stopped short when he saw me. Oh, Mrs. Whitmore. Again, that name, that recognition. His face changed immediately with nervous respect. You don't have to come through here, ma'am. Before I could answer, Vanessa suddenly appeared behind us, too quickly, like she'd rushed over to control the situation. Her smile tightened again. It's fine, she said smoothly. She gets overwhelmed in crowded spaces. Overwhelmed, another word people use when they want to shrink you politely. The young employee looked confused. His eyes moved from her to me, then back again. I saw the exact moment he realized something didn't add up, and for the first time that morning, I saw uncertainty flicker across Vanessa's face too. Just for a second. Tiny, but real. She recovered immediately. Come on, she said, touching my elbow lightly. Let's get you seated before the ceremony starts. Get you seated, like I was 89 and wandering through traffic. I wanted to pull my arm away. Instead, I let her guide me. Because sometimes dignity isn't loud. Sometimes dignity is surviving the moment without giving cruel people the performance they want. The ballroom overlooked the golf course through massive windows. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors. At the center of the room stood enormous white floral arrangements that probably cost more than my first car. Tyler spotted me immediately. Thank God for that boy. Grandma? His face lit up genuinely as he crossed the room to hug me. Real warmth, real love. I nearly cried from relief. You came, he said. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Vanessa watched us carefully from behind her wine glass. Not angry, calculated, like someone adjusting a plan in real time. Tyler introduced me to his fiancée, Madison. Sweet girl, nervous smile, soft Texas accent. But before we could speak long, Vanessa interrupted smoothly. Tyler, sweetheart, table photos are starting. He nodded, then squeezed my hand before leaving. And suddenly, I was alone again. That's the thing people don't understand about public humiliation. The cruel moment lasts seconds, but the isolation afterward, that's what stays. I found my table near the back corner of the ballroom, not with immediate family, not near Daniel, not near Tyler, near the bathrooms. I sat slowly without saying a word. Around me, conversations softened. A few people smiled politely. Most avoided eye contact. Nobody wants to get too close to discomfort at events like these, especially wealthy people. They treat tension like smoke, something to quietly step away from. A waitress poured water into my glass, then paused. You okay, ma'am? Such a small question, but kindness catches older people off guard sometimes, especially after loneliness becomes routine. I smiled softly. I'm fine. She nodded politely, but she didn't believe me. Neither did I. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood surrounded by guests, beautiful, confident, perfectly in control. Every now and then her eyes drifted toward my table, checking, monitoring, making sure I stayed small. And the strange thing was, part of me still wanted her approval. Isn't that pathetic? At 68 years old, after raising children and bearing a husband and surviving decades of life, I still wanted my daughter-in-law to look at me kindly. The brunch officially began 20 minutes later. Champagne glasses clinked, people applauded, a jazz trio started playing softly near the terrace. Then Vanessa walked toward the microphone, elegant, poised, dangerous in the way polished people often are. She thanked everyone for coming, talked about family legacy, tradition, new beginnings. Then her eyes found me, and something cold moved behind her smile. I'm especially grateful, she said lightly, for the people who support this family quietly from the sidelines. Several guests nodded politely. Then Vanessa added, even when they don't always understand how things work nowadays. A few people chuckled. Not loudly, but enough. Enough for me to feel every eye shift toward my table. Toward me. I lowered my gaze to my water glass. My hands remained perfectly still. That took effort, because inside, something old and wounded was beginning to wake up. And across the ballroom, the club manager had just entered the room. The moment he saw me, he froze. Then his entire expression changed, and Vanessa hadn't noticed yet, but she was about to. The club manager was still staring at me from across the ballroom, not casually, not politely, staring the way people do when they suddenly recognize someone important after making a terrible mistake. And somehow, that frightened me more than Vanessa's humiliation did, because I had spent the last 2 years trying very hard not to be important anymore. After Richard died, disappearing happened slowly. That's the cruel part. Families rarely throw older women away all at once. They do it inch by inch, quietly, politely, until one day you realize nobody asks where you've been anymore. The jazz music continued softly through the ballroom while guests laughed around linen-covered tables. But suddenly, I wasn't hearing any of it. I was hearing another sound instead, the silence of my house after Richard's funeral. I still remember the first morning alone. The coffee maker sounded too loud. The refrigerator hummed like an engine. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway felt aggressive. 41 years of marriage leaves echoes inside walls. People talk about grief like sadness. But loneliness? Loneliness is logistical. It's realizing nobody else notices when the lights burn out. Nobody asks whether you got home safely in the rain. Nobody reaches for your hand during commercials anymore.
For the first few weeks after the funeral, Daniel called almost every day. Vanessa even brought casseroles. Flowers arrived constantly. Cards, messages, voicemails. Then gradually, everything slowed, like the world quietly correcting itself after pretending to care. 3 months later, the calls became weekly, then every other week, then mostly texts. "Busy week, Mom. Sorry, traveling. We'll come by soon." Soon. That word became another form of goodbye. At first, I made excuses for them. People have jobs, children, lives. I told myself not to become one of those needy older mothers people whisper about at dinner parties. So I stayed careful. Careful not to ask for too much. Careful not to sound lonely. Careful not to become inconvenient. Women from my generation were trained that way. We learned to fold our pain neatly enough that nobody else had to carry it. But loneliness grows in silence, especially inside big houses. Richard and I bought our home in Westport in 1994 after years of impossible work. 6 bedrooms, white columns, a wraparound porch he insisted made me look southern and elegant. After he died, the house became too large for one heartbeat. I started leaving televisions on in empty rooms, just to hear human voices. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, about 6 months after the funeral, I drove 40 minutes to Tyler's soccer game. Nobody knew I was coming. I sat 3 rows up in aluminum bleachers, wearing gloves because the wind was brutal. Tyler spotted me immediately. He waved so hard he nearly dropped his water bottle. That boy always did love me loudly. But during halftime, Vanessa walked over with tight shoulders and a smile that looked stapled into place. "You should have told us you were coming." I laughed softly. I didn't think I needed a reservation. She didn't laugh. Around us, parents huddled under blankets, sipping coffee from thermoses. Vanessa lowered her voice. "Tyler gets distracted when extra people show up unexpectedly." Extra people. I still remember those words exactly, because grief sharpens humiliation into memory. I nodded slowly. "Oh, I understand." And I did. That was the terrifying part. I understood perfectly.
On the drive home, I cried at a red light near Fairfield because a teenage cashier at a gas station had called me sweetheart in the same voice people use for confused patients. A year earlier, I would have brushed it off, but loneliness changes the weight of small things. You begin collecting humiliations like receipts. The next Thanksgiving, Vanessa suggested they host dinner at their house instead. "Less stressful for you," she explained. Stressful. Another soft word. I arrived carrying Richard's pecan pie recipe in a glass dish wrapped carefully in towels. The house smelled like rosemary turkey and cinnamon candles. For one beautiful moment, I thought maybe things were normal again. Then I walked into the dining room. There wasn't a seat for me. Not literally. There was technically a chair squeezed awkwardly near the corner beside the kitchen doorway, away from everyone else, like an afterthought added too late. Vanessa smiled brightly. We had to improvise a little. I sat there anyway, quietly. From that angle, I could barely hear conversations. Nobody intentionally ignored me. That's what made it hurt worse. They simply adapted around my absence without noticing. At one point, Tyler asked me about an old Disney trip Richard and I took him on when he was little. Before I could answer fully, Vanessa interrupted. Tyler, honey, let Grandma eat. Grandma. Not Mom. Not Diane. Just Grandma. Like my entire identity now existed only through usefulness. I looked down at my untouched pie and suddenly realized nobody had asked me to bring anything except dessert. Not stuffing, not turkey, not recipes. Dessert. Something sweet people sample briefly before moving on. That night I washed my makeup off slowly while staring at my reflection. I looked older than 68. Not physically. Emotionally. Like rejection itself had aged me. The strange thing about being excluded from your own family is that it never sounds dramatic when you describe it out loud. Nobody screams, nobody slams doors. It's smaller than that. You simply stop being included in decisions, then conversations, then memories, until eventually people discuss future plans in front of you without imagining you inside them.
The grandchildren hurt the most. Emma used to sleep over constantly after Richard died. We baked brownies at midnight and watched old black and white movies she pretended to enjoy. Then suddenly, the sleepover stopped. School's busy, cheer practice, weekend tournament. Always reasons. Reasonable reasons. That's how sophisticated exclusion works. One afternoon, I called to ask if Emma wanted to come shopping with me before Christmas. Vanessa answered. There was loud background noise behind her, probably Target. Oh, we already finished Emma shopping. I smiled into the phone anyway. That's okay. Maybe lunch then? A pause. Not long, but long enough to bruise. We're trying to cut back on commitments this year. Commitments. I almost laughed, as though spending time with me had become a scheduling burden. Then came the birthday dinner. That one stayed with me. Daniel turned 52 in November. I spent 2 weeks searching for the perfect gift, a vintage watch identical to one Richard used to wear. Expensive, meaningful, personal. When I arrived at the restaurant, everyone was already seated. Vanessa glanced up and blinked like she'd forgotten I was coming. Oh. Again that word. Always oh. The hostess scrambled awkwardly to squeeze another chair onto the end of the table. Menu shifted, silverware moved. Conversations paused. I felt like someone arriving at the wrong wedding. Daniel hugged me quickly without standing. Glad you made it. Made it, like I'd crossed state lines during a snowstorm instead of driving 15 minutes. Dinner moved around me instead of with me. At one point, Vanessa laughed with another couple about people refusing to downsize after retirement. Then she glanced directly at me. Subtle, clean, impossible to confront without sounding sensitive. That was her talent. Vanessa never insulted directly. She curated humiliation carefully enough that other people could pretend not to notice. And Daniel, God, that part still hurts.
Because my son wasn't cruel, weakness can wound people just as deeply as cruelty. He simply stopped interrupting her, stopped defending me, stopped seeing things. Or maybe seeing them became inconvenient. Sometimes I wonder if men slowly disappear emotionally because confronting tension exhausts them. Richard never did, but Richard belonged to a different generation of men. One night, nearly a year after the funeral, I called Daniel because my kitchen sink was leaking badly. Nothing catastrophic, I just needed help. He sighed before I even finished speaking. Not dramatically, just tired. Mom, have you thought about maybe moving somewhere smaller? There it was, the sentence hidden beneath all the others. Not concern, transition, relocation, containment. I stared at water dripping slowly into a pot beneath the sink. I like my house. Another sigh. You rattle around in there alone. Alone. Funny how people weaponize the very loneliness they helped create. That night, I sat at the kitchen table until almost 1 a.m., listening to the leak. Drip, drip, drip. And for the first time in my life, I felt old. Not because of wrinkles, not because of my knees, because I suddenly understood my family had begun emotionally preparing for a future where I existed somewhere farther away, smaller, quieter, less visible.
At the country club brunch, I watched Vanessa laughing with guests beneath crystal chandeliers, while all those memories moved through me at once. The ignored phone calls, the awkward chairs, the careful exclusions, the slow reduction of my life into inconvenience. And still, I had stayed polite, because older women are expected to absorb emotional damage gracefully, especially wealthy older women. People assume comfort cancels pain. It doesn't. Money buys privacy, not belonging. Across the ballroom, the club manager was now speaking urgently with another employee, both of them looking toward me repeatedly. Vanessa finally noticed, and for the first time all morning, her smile faltered, just slightly. Then Daniel turned to follow her gaze, and his entire expression changed too, like he suddenly realized there was something about his own mother he never fully understood. Something important, something hidden. And before either of them could react, the manager started walking directly toward our table. The club manager moved quickly, too quickly for a simple greeting. His polished black shoes crossed the ballroom floor with the kind of urgency wealthy places usually try very hard to hide. Around him, servers stepped aside immediately. One hostess straightened her posture the second she saw where he was headed, toward me, toward the awkward little table near the bathrooms, where my daughter-in-law had quietly placed me. I felt Vanessa notice it before I even looked up. You can sense panic in people sometimes. It changes the air around them. Daniel turned halfway in his chair, confused. Vanessa's smile froze for only a fraction of a second before returning, but it wasn't the same smile anymore. Now it looked careful.
The manager stopped beside my table. Mrs. Whitmore. His voice carried just enough volume to turn nearby heads. Not loud, but country club quiet has its own acoustics, the kind where whispers travel farther than shouting. I looked up slowly. Good morning, Arthur. The second I said his first name, something shifted around us. Guests noticed. People in places like Blackstone notice familiarity, especially familiarity with management. Arthur looked genuinely distressed. I had no idea you were seated back here. Back here. Not this section. Back here. Like even he understood exactly what had happened. Vanessa stood immediately. Oh, she's perfectly fine, she said lightly while approaching us. We just wanted to give her somewhere quieter. Arthur turned toward her politely, but only politely, not warmly. I see. That was all he said, but I watched his expression carefully, and for the first time all morning, I realized something. Arthur knew who I was. Not socially, not casually, completely. Vanessa didn't understand that yet, but her instincts clearly told her something was wrong. The ballroom suddenly felt hotter. The jazz trio continued near the windows, but conversations nearby had softened noticeably. People were listening now, watching. Upper-class Americans pretend not to stare, but they always stare, especially when social balance starts wobbling.
Arthur looked back at me. Would you prefer the Whitmore table prepared near the terrace? Whitmore table. The words landed strangely in the room. I saw confusion move across several faces instantly. One older man near the champagne station actually lowered his newspaper. Vanessa laughed softly. Oh goodness, Arthur, that won't be necessary. Again, that careful social tone, the one wealthy women use when trying to regain control publicly without appearing emotional. Arthur didn't answer her immediately. That silence mattered, because in rooms like this, hierarchy lives inside pauses. Instead, he waited for my response. Mine, not hers. I suddenly became very aware of my heartbeat. Slow, heavy. A strange memory surfaced unexpectedly. Richard standing in this same ballroom 27 years earlier, wearing a gray wool suit and holding blueprints under his arm. We had fought in the parking lot before that meeting because we were terrified. The country club had nearly collapsed financially back then. Most people here today didn't even know that. Or maybe they'd forgotten. Rich communities have selective memory. They remember champagne renovations, not debt, not panic, not the families who quietly kept everything alive behind the scenes. Arthur was still waiting. So was the room. Vanessa folded her arms loosely. Tiny movement, defensive. No, I said gently. This is fine. Arthur hesitated, and that hesitation told me more than words could. He didn't think it was fine at all, but he nodded professionally. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. Again with the name, again with the respect. Then he leaned slightly closer. There are some documents I've been meaning to deliver personally. Documents. Vanessa blinked. Just once, but sharply. Oh, she said with a little laugh. Nothing bad, I hope. Arthur finally looked directly at her. No, ma'am. Ma'am. Interesting. Not Mrs. Calloway. Not Vanessa. Just ma'am. Polite distance. Then he turned back to me. When you have time.
I nodded slowly. Thank you, Arthur. He gave a small, respectful incline of his head before walking away. And the second he left, the whispers started. Quiet, contained, but alive, like static spreading across the room. Vanessa sat back down beside Daniel too quickly. Her champagne glass touched the table harder than intended, tiny crack against crystal. Daniel frowned slightly. Do you know him well? Such a ridiculous question, but grief changes families. Children stop seeing parents as complete people, especially mothers, especially widows. I smiled carefully. A little. Vanessa studied me now. Really studied me. Not like before when she'd inspected my shoes and coat. This was different. Calculation. I could almost hear her rearranging information in her head, trying to understand why the manager looked nervous around me, why staff kept recognizing me, why older members across the ballroom occasionally glanced over with curiosity. And suddenly, I understood something too. This brunch invitation had never been about reconciliation. It had been staged, curated, controlled. Vanessa invited me because she believed I would arrive diminished, lonely widow, social leftover, aging inconvenience, safe to embarrass, safe to shrink publicly. That realization settled inside me slowly, like cold water filling a sink. And somehow, that hurt more than the insults themselves, because humiliation from strangers is cruelty. Humiliation from family is strategy.
A server approached carrying trays of lobster benedict and fruit parfaits. The scent of butter and coffee filled the air. Vanessa immediately slipped back into performance mode. Oh my God, everyone has to try the imported preserves, she laughed to another woman nearby. Perfect posture, perfect smile. But every few seconds, her eyes drifted back toward me, checking, monitoring, the way people monitor unstable situations before they understand them. I noticed something else too. Several older members had started recognizing me now. A silver-haired woman near the windows narrowed her eyes, then suddenly gasped softly to her husband. He looked over immediately afterward. Recognition, again. A younger couple whispered while glancing between me and Arthur near the bar. The room was changing, subtly, social gravity shifting 1 inch at a time, and Vanessa could feel it. That's the thing about wealthy social environments. Power isn't always spoken, it's sensed. Who greets whom first, who receives attention, whose name opens doors. And suddenly, people were unsure where I belonged in that hierarchy. That uncertainty terrified Vanessa more than anger ever could. Daniel leaned toward me quietly. You never mentioned knowing Arthur. I almost laughed. You never asked, I thought. But I didn't say it. Instead, I looked at my son carefully, really looked at him. There were lines around his eyes Richard never had. Fatigue lines, avoidance lines. Marriage had softened him into someone constantly trying to prevent conflict instead of confronting truth. I haven't talked about many things lately, I said gently. His expression shifted slightly. Guilt. Then Vanessa interrupted brightly before silence could deepen. So Madison's parents are thinking Tuscany for the wedding. The subject change felt violent in its cheerfulness. Daniel immediately followed it. Of course he did. That's what people do when tension threatens comfort. They relocate conversation. But the atmosphere had already changed. I could feel it in the room. More guests were watching now. Not openly, discreetly. A waiter refilled my water before anyone else's. A hostess approached to ask if I needed anything personally. And every act of respect seemed to tighten Vanessa further. Then came the moment that confirmed everything. A woman I recognized vaguely from years ago approached our table, wearing emerald silk and diamonds large enough to look exhausting. Diane Whitmore? I stood politely. Margaret Ellis. She touched my arm warmly. My goodness, I haven't seen you since Richard passed. Her voice softened genuinely at his name. Then she looked around the table. I didn't realize the Whitmores were hosting today. Hosting. There it was. Vanessa's face changed instantly. Tiny, sharp, dangerous. I smiled carefully. Oh no, today belongs to Tyler and Madison. Margaret blinked once. Confused now.
Arthur said, she stopped herself. Too late. Vanessa heard every word, and for the first time all morning, I saw actual fear flicker across her face. Small, controlled, but real. Margaret recovered gracefully. Well, she laughed softly. It's lovely to see you again. Then she leaned closer. Richard would have been proud you came today. That nearly undid me, because suddenly I remembered the last brunch Richard and I attended here together. Same ballroom, same chandeliers. His hand resting against my lower back as we danced slowly after too much wine. At one point he whispered, "This place wouldn't exist without you." I hadn't thought about that sentence in years, and judging by the way Arthur kept glancing toward me across the room, maybe he hadn't forgotten it either. Margaret walked away. Vanessa immediately picked up her champagne, but her hand trembled slightly. Tiny movement, easy to miss. Not for me. "Excuse me," she said suddenly. "I need to check on the seating upstairs." Then she walked off too quickly. Daniel watched her leave, then looked back at me. "What's going on?" Simple question, complicated answer. I opened my mouth, then stopped, because at that exact moment, I noticed two employees carrying thick leather folders toward Arthur near the front desk, folders stamped with a Blackstone crest. Arthur looked directly at me again, then at the folders, then back at me, and something deep in my stomach turned cold, because suddenly I realized Vanessa might not be the only person here hiding something. Arthur kept glancing toward the leather folders like they contained explosives, and maybe they did. Not literally, but socially? Emotionally? Yes, absolutely. Across the ballroom, Vanessa had returned to her table smile, that polished country club smile women wear when they're trying desperately to look unbothered. But she was watching me now, almost constantly, the same way people watch dark clouds gathering offshore. Not fully afraid yet, just aware something unpleasant may be coming. Daniel leaned closer again. "Mom, seriously, what's going on?" His voice stayed low, careful, like he didn't want to embarrass anyone publicly. Funny, that concern had arrived a little late. I looked down at my untouched coffee. The cream had formed pale swirls across the surface. For a moment, I almost told him everything. Not because I wanted revenge, because I was tired. Tired in the deep way older women become tired. Not physically, emotionally. Tired of shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. But before I could answer, Arthur approached again. This time slower, more formal. One of the younger employees followed behind him, carrying the leather folders against his chest carefully with both hands. The Blackstone crest gleamed in gold across the covers. I watched Vanessa notice them immediately. Her eyes narrowed slightly, then widened, then narrowed again. Calculation. Always calculation. Arthur stopped beside me. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "would now be an appropriate time." The entire nearby section had gone subtly silent. Nobody looked directly at us anymore, which meant everyone was listening. That's how wealthy rooms work. People pretend dignity while hunting scandal. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table. My hands remained perfectly steady. That surprised even me. "Yes," I said softly. Arthur nodded once, then opened the first folder. The moment the papers became visible, I saw Daniel's entire posture change, because his last name was printed across the top. Whitmore Property Holdings, LLC. I hadn't seen those documents in nearly 11 years. The sight of them felt strangely intimate, like opening old love letters in public. Daniel frowned immediately. "What is that?" Arthur looked toward him politely. "Corporate ownership record, sir." "Sir." Not Mr. Calloway. Not Daniel. Interesting again. Vanessa let out a soft laugh that sounded brittle around the edges. "Oh my goodness, are we doing business paperwork at brunch now?" Nobody laughed with her. That silence landed harder than any insult. Arthur carefully slid one page toward me. The board needed updated authorization signatures after Mr. Whitmore's passing. Mr. Whitmore. Richard. Even hearing his name formally still tightened something inside my chest. For a second, the ballroom disappeared completely, and I was 29 again, standing beside Richard in an unfinished building filled with exposed wiring and leaking ceilings. Blackstone Country Club before it became Blackstone Country Club.
Most people there that morning would never believe what it used to look like. Rotting carpet, broken windows, bank notices, debt everywhere. In 1984, the place had nearly collapsed. The original investors pulled out after a disastrous expansion project left the property bleeding money. Banks were circling like vultures. Half the town expected demolition. Richard saw opportunity instead. I saw danger. We were still middle class back then. Daniel was in high school. Our mortgage payments already terrified me. I still remember the night Richard spread blueprints across our kitchen table while eating canned soup because we couldn't afford takeout that week. This place could become something incredible, he told me. I laughed. Or bankrupt us completely. He grinned. That too. God, I loved him for that smile. Richard believed in impossible things so confidently. It made fear feel temporary.
But the truth? The club survived because of me, not because Richard lacked vision, because I understood numbers, risk, contracts, structures. While Richard negotiated construction and investors publicly, I quietly built the legal architecture underneath everything: holding companies, land protections, asset separation. I spent nights studying commercial property law at our dining room table after Daniel went to sleep. Most people assumed I was helping my husband. That's what women were called back then, even when they were doing half the work. Helping. Such a small word for carrying entire futures. The first winter nearly destroyed us. We refinanced the house twice. I sold jewelry from my grandmother. At one point, we lived 3 straight months on tuna casserole and instant coffee. Richard lost 15 pounds from stress. One February night, I found him sitting alone inside the unfinished ballroom under temporary lighting. Same ballroom I sat in now. He looked exhausted, scared, human. I dragged you into this, he whispered. I sat beside him on the dusty floor, wearing boots and a wool coat because there was no heat yet. Then I took his hand. No, I told him. We built it together. That mattered to him. Being seen fully mattered to Richard. Maybe that's why losing him hurt differently than aging itself. Because after he died, nobody looked at me like a builder anymore. Only a widow.
Arthur turned another page slowly, and suddenly the legal structure sat exposed across polished linen tables and untouched champagne glasses. The land beneath Blackstone Country Club had eventually been divided decades ago during expansion. The golf operations belonged to the club. The restaurants belonged to hospitality management. But the central building itself, the ballroom, private dining halls, administrative offices, event wing, remained other Whitmore property holdings. Mine. Not socially, legally. After Richard died, his ownership transferred fully through the trust structure we created years earlier. Clean, protected, quiet. Most members never knew, and honestly, I preferred it that way. Power feels safer when it isn't performed. Daniel stared down at the documents, then at me, then back again. Mom. Just that. Mom. But this time it sounded different. Not distracted. Not impatient. Disoriented. Vanessa finally leaned forward sharply. I'm sorry, she said with a strained little laugh. What exactly are we looking at here? Arthur answered calmly. Mrs. Whitmore is the principal property holder of the main facility. The silence afterward became enormous. Not dramatic. Worse. Controlled. A nearby fork clinked softly against china. Someone coughed near the terrace. And across the ballroom, I watched 3 different people suddenly turn toward us at once. Vanessa blinked several times. No, she said immediately, too quickly. That can't be right. Arthur remained perfectly composed. The structure has been in place since 1989. 1989, the year Richard and I almost lost everything. The year we mortgaged our future to keep Blackstone alive. I remembered standing beside Richard during the reopening gala after renovations were finally complete. Music filled the ballroom, champagne everywhere, people praising his brilliance, his vision, his ambition. And Richard? He spent the entire evening introducing me to everyone as the smartest person in this building. I used to blush every time he said it. Back then, being loved publicly felt normal. Now it felt almost fictional. Vanessa's face had gone pale beneath her makeup, not because of money, because of humiliation. I recognized the emotion instantly. She had invited me there expecting weakness, fragility, social dependence. Instead, the room was quietly recalculating itself around me, and wealthy rooms recalculate fast. One older member suddenly stood and walked toward our table, smiling warmly. "Diane," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I had no idea you still held ownership." Still held ownership, as though I'd been absent temporarily, instead of erased socially. Others began glancing over more openly now, recognition spreading person by person, like lights turning on across a dark street. Vanessa noticed every single one. Her breathing had changed. Tiny, shallow breaths, the kind women take when panic must remain invisible. Daniel still looked stunned. "You never told me." There it was. Not accusation, confusion. Because children assume they know their parents completely, especially aging parents, especially mothers. I looked at him quietly. "You never asked about the business after your father died." That landed harder than I intended. I saw it immediately in his eyes. Guilt. Real guilt this time. Vanessa suddenly stood. "Well," she laughed too brightly, "this is certainly unexpected." Nobody responded. Even the jazz trio seemed quieter now. She picked up her champagne glass, set it back down, then forced another smile toward nearby guests. "You know how complicated family investments can be." Family investments. Interesting choice of words. Because technically, Vanessa had spent years trying to establish social dominance inside a building I legally owned. And she never knew. Not once. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Tired that respect arrived only after paperwork. Tired that kindness depended on status. Tired that the same room which ignored me 30 minutes earlier suddenly looked at me differently because of ownership records.
Arthur carefully closed the folder again. "There are updated authorization forms requiring signature when convenient, Mrs. Whitmore." Convenient, like this wasn't detonating socially in real time. I nodded once. "We'll discuss it later." Arthur hesitated, then lowered his voice slightly. "There's one additional matter regarding executive privileges." Privileges. Vanessa's eyes snapped toward him instantly, and something in Arthur's expression told me this situation was about to become much worse for her. The word privileges hung in the air longer than it should have. Arthur immediately seemed to realize he had said too much, but it was already there now, visible, alive. Vanessa stared at him with the controlled smile of a woman trying not to panic publicly. "What kind of privileges?" she asked lightly. Too lightly. Arthur adjusted his cuff. "The executive family accounts tied to the Whitmore ownership structure." Silence. Not awkward silence. Dangerous silence. The kind where wealthy people suddenly become fascinated by their wine glasses because nobody wants to be caught witnessing social collapse directly. I could actually feel the ballroom listening. Nearby conversations slowed. The jazz trio near the terrace continued softly, but now the music sounded distant somehow, muted beneath tension. Daniel frowned harder. "Executive family accounts?" Arthur gave a polite nod. "Yes, sir." "Sir," again. Always sir. Never family. Never ownership. Daniel looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. And maybe he was, because somewhere over the last decade, my son had quietly stopped imagining I existed outside motherhood, outside widowhood, outside aging. He forgot I once built things. Vanessa laughed again. Another brittle little sound. "Well," she said, reaching for her champagne, "this brunch suddenly got very educational." Nobody responded. Not one person. And that's when I saw it. The first real crack in her confidence.
People like Vanessa survive through social momentum, admiration, control, presentation. But the moment Arun stops validating them, they begin unraveling quietly from the inside out. Arthur cleared his throat gently. If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Whitmore, I'll leave the documents with you for later review. He placed the folders carefully beside me. Not beside Daniel, not in the center of the table. Beside me. Then he added something that changed everything. Also, the board asked me to personally confirm whether you intend to continue extending guest privileges under the family designation. Vanessa froze completely. The phrase hit her instantly. Guest privileges, not membership. Privileges. Granted. Temporary. Revocable. I watched understanding move across her face in real time, and for the first time all morning, she looked small.
Arthur offered a respectful nod before walking away. The second he disappeared into the crowd, Vanessa leaned toward Daniel sharply. What exactly is happening right now? Too fast, too emotional. People at nearby tables absolutely heard her. Daniel still looked stunned. I don't know. Then he turned toward me. Mom? I should have answered. Instead, I took a slow sip of water. Not to be dramatic, because my mouth had suddenly gone dry. All around us, subtle social movement had begun. Members who ignored me earlier were now smiling politely when our eyes met. Servers suddenly appeared faster near my table. One older couple even nodded respectfully while passing. The room was recalibrating itself, and Vanessa felt every inch of it happening. That's the brutal thing about upper-class environments. Status moves invisibly until suddenly it doesn't. Then everyone notices at once. The brunch coordinator stepped onto the small stage near the ballroom windows. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced warmly, we're about to begin the family toast for the happy couple. Applause spread politely across the room. Relief flashed through Vanessa's face instantly. A reset, a chance to regain control publicly. She stood smoothly, adjusted her cream-colored blazer, and reclaimed her performance smile. I recognized the strategy immediately. When embarrassed people can't control facts, they try controlling atmosphere. Vanessa moved gracefully toward the microphone while servers distributed fresh champagne. Daniel touched my arm quietly before she spoke. Why didn't Dad ever tell me any of this? There was genuine hurt in his voice now, not financial curiosity, emotional confusion. I looked at him carefully. Your father assumed you were listening. That one hurt him. I saw it land. Before he could answer, Vanessa lifted her champagne flute beneath the chandelier lights. The room quieted instantly. She was good at this, I'll give her that. Beautiful people with social confidence know exactly how to hold attention. To family, she began warmly. Soft applause. To tradition, more smiles. To new beginnings. The ballroom glowed gold beneath crystal lighting, while champagne sparkled across white linen tables. Everything looked perfect, which made what happened next feel even crueler.
Vanessa smiled toward Tyler and Madison first. Then gradually, her eyes drifted toward me and stayed there. You know, she continued lightly, family legacies can be complicated. A few guests chuckled softly. Daniel's posture stiffened beside me. Vanessa continued, especially when some people struggle to let go of the past. There it was. Not direct enough to confront, sharp enough to wound. Classic Vanessa. But today felt different now, because people understood there was subtext underneath her words. The room had context now, and context changes humiliation. I kept my expression calm. Vanessa smiled wider. Sometimes, she said, the younger generation has to gently help older relatives accept that the world moves forward. Another scattered laugh, smaller this time, uncertain. I noticed several guests avoiding eye contact completely now, because suddenly her jokes no longer sounded elegant, they sounded dangerous. Daniel whispered sharply, Vanessa. But she ignored him. Of course she did. By then, embarrassment had already cornered her psychologically, and embarrassed people often become crueler before they collapse. She raised her glass slightly higher. I mean, honestly, tiny laugh, there comes a point when clinging to status symbols becomes a little sad, doesn't it? Now the room went fully quiet. No laughter. None. Because everyone understood exactly who she meant. Me. The widow sitting quietly beside ownership documents. The older woman she'd spent the entire morning trying to reduce publicly. I felt heat rise slowly into my chest. Not rage. Something colder. Clarity. And strangely, I suddenly stopped feeling ashamed. That surprised me most, because humiliation only works when you secretly believe you deserve it. And for the first time in years, I didn't. Vanessa mistook my silence for weakness again. Big mistake. She smiled toward nearby guests. You know how some people are. They think being around success means they created it. A woman near the terrace visibly winced. Someone set down a fork too loudly. Even Tyler looked uncomfortable now. Madison touched his arm nervously. Daniel stood halfway from his chair. That's enough. But Vanessa kept going, no longer fully in control of herself. The room had shifted socially, and she was trying desperately to pull it back. I'm just saying, she laughed tightly. There's dignity in stepping aside gracefully instead of pretending you still belong somewhere. Still belong somewhere. The exact phrase, the exact cruelty. Public now, intentional now. And suddenly every humiliation from the last 2 years aligned perfectly inside my mind. The forgotten invitations, the isolated tables, the patronizing smiles, the confused comments, the polite exclusions. It had never been accidental. Vanessa didn't simply dislike me. She wanted me erased. Socially, emotionally, gradually. And she wanted witnesses while it happened. The ballroom felt frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted her. Because wealthy Americans often confuse politeness with morality. They watch cruelty quietly as long as it's well-dressed.
Then Arthur reappeared. Not alone this time. 2 board members walked beside him. Older men, serious expressions. One carried another folder. Vanessa saw them immediately and stopped mid-sentence. The silence afterward became unbearable. Arthur approached the stage calmly. Mrs. Calloway, he said politely, may I speak with Mrs. Whitmore for a moment regarding executive authorization? Mrs. Calloway, not Vanessa, not family, just Mrs. Calloway. The demotion was subtle, brutal. Vanessa lowered her champagne glass slowly. I'm in the middle of a toast. Arthur remained composed. I understand. Then one of the board members spoke quietly, but this matter is time-sensitive. Now people were openly staring. No pretending anymore. The room had crossed that line. Vanessa looked around desperately for social support. She found none, because elite crowds abandon sinking people incredibly fast. Daniel stood completely still beside me, shocked. Tyler looked confused. Madison looked terrified. And I remained seated, quiet, calm. The same woman Vanessa mocked 30 minutes earlier. Arthur turned toward me respectfully. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully, we need your decision before the renewal forms are finalized. Renewal forms. Vanessa's face drained of color completely, because somehow she already knew. Whatever those forms contained, they were about to change everything. Vanessa's fingers tightened around the champagne flute so hard I thought the crystal might crack. The ballroom had gone completely still now, not silent, still, like the entire room was holding one long collective breath. Arthur remained beside the stage with the 2 board members standing slightly behind him, calm, professional, immovable. And suddenly the power balance inside Blackstone Country Club no longer belonged to Vanessa. It belonged to paperwork, to history, to me. Renewal forms for what? Vanessa asked carefully, too carefully. Her voice had changed. Gone was the bright social confidence from earlier. Now she sounded like someone walking across ice she no longer trusted. Arthur glanced toward me first before answering, always toward me. The Whitmore executive designation controls sponsorship privileges, event access, private reservations, and legacy family standing within the club. Every word hit harder than the last. I watched nearby guests exchange quick glances immediately, because people like this understood exactly what those terms meant. Status, influence, social protection. Vanessa swallowed visibly. Daniel stared at Arthur. You're saying my mother controls all of that? Arthur hesitated only briefly. Yes, sir. Sir, again. But this time the word sounded almost ceremonial, a respectful distance from actual authority. Daniel slowly turned toward me, and I saw something painful move across his face. Recognition. Not of ownership, of me, the real me, maybe for the first time in years. You built this place? He asked quietly, not accusing, almost childlike. I looked at him for a moment before answering. Your father and I did. The ballroom lights reflected softly against polished marble floors, while waiters stood awkwardly frozen with silver trays in their hands. Nobody wanted to move first, because something irreversible was happening socially.
One of the board members stepped forward slightly. Older gentleman, white hair, navy blazer. Your mother saved Blackstone in '89, he said to Daniel calmly. Most of us wouldn't still be members without her. A ripple moved through the room instantly. Tiny whispers, tiny reactions, but enough. Enough for Vanessa to understand this was no longer private embarrassment. This was public collapse. No, she said quietly. Then louder. No,
This is ridiculous. Her smile returned suddenly, desperate now, artificial. You're all acting like Diane owns the entire club. Arthur answered immediately. She owns the primary property holding company for the facility. Not emotional, not aggressive, just factual. That made it worse. Vanessa laughed sharply. This has to be some kind of misunderstanding. But nobody rushed to comfort her. Nobody reassured her. And in upper-class environments, silence is often the loudest judgment. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us? I almost smiled at that, because the answer felt heartbreakingly simple. You stopped asking about my life after your father died. That one reached him, deeply. I saw his jaw tighten, saw guilt settle into his shoulders like physical weight. For a moment, he looked less like a successful man in his 50s and more like the teenage boy who used to apologize after breaking things accidentally around the house. Except this time, the broken thing was me. Vanessa interrupted quickly before the silence deepened again. Well, she said tightly, ownership paperwork doesn't make someone socially relevant. There it was, the line, the one she shouldn't have crossed. I heard an audible inhale from somewhere near the terrace. Even the board members looked uncomfortable now, because cruelty sounds uglier when rich people stop pretending not to notice it. I remained seated, calm. That upset Vanessa more than anger ever could. She needed me emotional, needed me wounded, needed me small. Instead, I simply folded my hands neatly in my lap and waited.
Arthur's expression cooled visibly. Mrs. Calloway, he said carefully, I would advise against continuing this discussion publicly. That sentence changed the room instantly, because it wasn't a suggestion. It was protection. For me. Vanessa stared at him. I'm her daughter-in-law. Arthur nodded once. Yes, ma'am. Again with ma'am. Cold, professional, distant. Not family. Never family. And suddenly, Vanessa understood what everyone else in the room already had. Inside Blackstone, she was socially attached. I was foundational. That realization hollowed her out in real time. She turned toward Daniel quickly. Say something. He didn't. Not immediately. Because Daniel was finally seeing two realities collide at once. The woman he allowed to become invisible, and the woman the entire ballroom clearly respected. A server approached nervously beside me. Mrs. Whitmore, he asked softly, would you prefer your brunch moved to the Founder's Terrace? Founder's Terrace. The words landed like a small explosion. Vanessa blinked hard. Tyler looked confused. Madison whispered something under her breath, and several older members nearby immediately turned toward me again, because there were only 3 families in Blackstone history with access to the Founder's Terrace: private dining, lifetime executive privileges, permanent reservation rights, old money hierarchy, the kind Americans pretend doesn't exist anymore. Vanessa looked physically ill now. She has access to the Founder's Terrace? She whispered. One board member answered before Arthur could. Mrs. Whitmore helped finance the East Wing expansion personally. Personally. I remembered those years instantly. Long nights reviewing contractor invoices at the kitchen table, Richard falling asleep beside stacks of paperwork, the smell of coffee and printer ink, fear, risk, hope. I had given decades of my life to this place, and somehow my own family reduced me to an inconvenience sitting near the bathrooms. The irony almost made me laugh. Daniel slowly sat back down. His face looked pale now. How much of this did Dad leave you? I met his eyes carefully. All of it was always ours. Not his father's. Ours. I needed him to hear that. Needed him to understand his mother had never simply stood beside greatness. I helped build it.
Vanessa suddenly set down her champagne glass too hard. The crystal stems snapped sharply against the tablecloth. Several people jumped. Red embarrassment flooded her face instantly. I need some air. But before she could move, Arthur spoke again. One more matter, Mrs. Whitmore. The room tightened immediately. Arthur opened the final folder slowly. I noticed Daniel tense beside me. Vanessa stopped walking. And somehow, I already knew this next part was going to destroy whatever control she had left. Arthur looked directly at me. The board also requested clarification regarding permanent legacy transfer authorization. Transfer authorization? Daniel frowned. What does that mean? The older board member answered quietly. It determines who inherits social and executive standing attached to the Whitmore designation after Mrs. Whitmore. Vanessa turned around so quickly her chair nearly tipped, and suddenly, every person in that ballroom understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't just about embarrassment anymore. This was about succession, status, power, future access. And judging by the look on Vanessa's face, she had just realized her own future at Blackstone might depend entirely on the woman she humiliated publicly.
The ballroom no longer sounded the same. 30 minutes earlier, it had been filled with easy laughter and expensive confidence. Now, every sound felt careful, measured, crystal touching crystal, a chair shifting softly across marble, someone whispering behind a linen napkin. The room had changed sides, quietly, completely. Vanessa understood it too. That was the cruel beauty of social humiliation inside places like Blackstone. Nobody announces your fall. They simply stop protecting you from it. She stood frozen beside the stage, one hand still wrapped around the broken champagne stem. A tiny line of red marked her finger where the crystal had nicked her skin, but she didn't notice. Or maybe she did and refused to react. Women like Vanessa survive through performance, and performances don't stop just because the audience turns hostile. She forced a laugh. "Oh my God," she said brightly, looking around the ballroom. "Everyone's acting like this is an episode of Succession." A few weak smiles appeared, out of politeness, not support. She felt that immediately. I watched it happen, the subtle delay before people responded, the avoidance of eye contact, the social distance growing around her, inch by inch. Upper-class cruelty rarely looks dramatic. It looks like abandonment. Daniel remained seated beside me, quiet now, really quiet. Not the distracted silence I'd grown used to over the years. This was thinking silence, painful silence, the kind that arrives when someone realizes they missed something important for far too long. He looked at the folders again, then at me, then back toward Vanessa, like he suddenly didn't know where to place either of us anymore. Tyler approached cautiously from across the ballroom. "Dad?" Nobody answered immediately. Poor boy. His engagement brunch had become something else entirely. Madison stayed close beside him, visibly nervous beneath her pale pink dress. I felt guilty for that. Honestly, I did. Because none of this should have happened in front of them. But humiliation has momentum. Once people start treating someone like they're invisible, eventually the truth surfaces in public.
Vanessa suddenly smiled toward Tyler too brightly. "Everything's fine, sweetheart." Fine. That word again. Americans use fine the way wealthy people use perfume, to cover rot. Tyler looked confused. Why is everyone staring? Nobody answered that either. Arthur stepped forward calmly. "We can continue this discussion privately if Mrs. Whitmore prefers." Again, Mrs. Whitmore. Every repetition tightened the room further, because titles matter in places like Blackstone, and Vanessa had spent years assuming she owned a social position she merely borrowed through marriage. I finally stood slowly from my chair. The room shifted instantly. Not dramatically, subtly, but I felt it. Conversation stopping, eyes lifting, even the server straightening slightly. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel old. I felt visible. There's a difference, a profound one. Vanessa stepped aside automatically as I moved toward the center aisle. Instinct, not respect. People move differently around authority, whether they admit it or not. I noticed her realize what she'd done immediately afterward. That tiny, involuntary surrender, it humiliated her more than anything Arthur said. I stopped near the ballroom windows overlooking the golf course. Snowlight reflected softly across the glass. Everything outside looked peaceful, perfect. Inside felt very different. "I don't want Tyler's engagement brunch ruined," I said calmly. My voice carried farther than expected. The room stayed silent, listening. I'm sure there's been enough confusion for one morning. Confusion. I used her own word deliberately. Vanessa noticed. Her jaw tightened. Daniel noticed too. Good. Arthur nodded respectfully. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore." I turned toward Tyler and Madison. "You both look beautiful today." Madison's eyes softened instantly. "Thank you." Real warmth, not performance. Tyler stepped closer. "Grandma?" Did Mom really not know? There it was, the question underneath all the others. Not about ownership, not about money, about cruelty. I looked at my grandson carefully, then at Vanessa. She looked terrified suddenly, not angry anymore, terrified. Because for the first time, people weren't questioning me, they were questioning her. And once social doubt begins, it spreads fast. I think, I said gently, sometimes people stop asking questions when they believe they already understand someone. Silence again, heavy this time. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. That answer hit exactly where it needed to.
Vanessa laughed sharply. Oh, come on. Are we seriously turning this into some emotional morality play? Nobody joined her. Not one person. That was the moment she truly started collapsing socially. I saw it happen in her face. The realization that her charm no longer worked in the room. One of the older women near the terrace suddenly approached me slowly. Margaret Ellis again. Elegant, as always. She touched my arm gently. "Diane," she said warmly, "you should have told people you were still involved with Blackstone." Still involved. Interesting phrasing. Like I had quietly disappeared instead of being pushed. I smiled faintly. I didn't realize it mattered. Margaret's expression changed subtly. Sadness. Understanding. "Oh," she said softly, and somehow that one tiny word nearly made me cry. Because women our age recognize humiliation in each other instantly. We've survived enough of it. Around us, the atmosphere kept shifting. A server arrived beside me carrying a fresh champagne flute personally. Another employee removed my untouched plate and replaced it with a hotter entree without being asked. Tiny gestures, but devastating ones socially, especially for Vanessa. Because every act of respect toward me became an indictment of how she treated me earlier. She noticed all of it, every single detail. Her breathing had turned shallow now, controlled panic. Daniel finally stood. "Mom," he said quietly. I turned toward him, and suddenly he looked heartbreakingly young to me again. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man realizing his father's death didn't just remove a parent, it erased the person who translated his mother for him. Richard used to make people see me. Without him, I slowly became background noise. Daniel swallowed hard. I didn't know. No excuses. No defensiveness. Just that. And somehow it hurt more. Because if he'd been cruel intentionally, maybe I could have hated him. But neglect born from weakness? That's harder. Vanessa interrupted immediately. "Daniel, stop acting like she's some helpless victim." The sentence landed horribly. Several people visibly recoiled. Even Tyler looked stunned. And Vanessa knew instantly she'd made another mistake. But embarrassment had already poisoned her judgment. That's the thing about public shame. Once people start unraveling socially, they often destroy themselves trying to regain control. "She never told us any of this," Vanessa continued quickly. "How are we supposed to know?" I looked at her calmly. "You knew enough not to see me near the family." Silence. Direct hint. No anger. No raised voice. Just truth. The ballroom practically stopped breathing. Vanessa's face flushed dark red. "That's not what happened." "Really?" I kept my tone soft. "You directed me toward the service hallway." Another silence. Longer now. Because witnesses remembered. The valet. The employees. The guests nearby. Social humiliation becomes dangerous when multiple people watched it happen. Daniel stared at Vanessa slowly. "You did what?" Her mouth opened immediately. I was trying to help her avoid confusion. Confusion, again. I saw Daniel's expression hardened for the first time all morning. Real hardening. Not embarrassment, disappointment. And Vanessa saw it too. That frightened her more than losing social standing, because suddenly the emotional foundation beneath her marriage didn't feel stable anymore. Arthur quietly handed me one final document. "The board will need your decision before the quarter closes." Quarter closes. Business language. Cold. Precise. Final. I glanced down briefly, then froze. Because attached to the legacy transfer paperwork was a list of every currently authorized Whitmore family beneficiary attached to Blackstone privileges. Every name. Every future inheritance designation. And one line had already been highlighted for review. Vanessa Calloway Whitmore.
pending renewal approval. I stared at the highlighted line for several seconds without speaking, not because I didn't understand it, because I understood it perfectly. Pending renewal approval. Such polite words for something so brutal. In places like Blackstone, power rarely arrives through shouting. It arrives through signatures, quiet decisions made over linen tablecloths and polished conference tables. And suddenly, Vanessa's entire future inside this world rested in my hands. I felt her eyes fixed on me immediately, watching, calculating, afraid. For the first time since Richard died, someone in my family looked afraid of losing me instead of inconvenienced by me. The realization settled into my chest slowly, heavy. Arthur lowered his voice respectfully. The renewal review must be finalized before the next board quarter, Mrs. Whitmore. Again with the respect. The room noticed every syllable. Daniel looked down at the document in my hands, then toward Vanessa, then back at me. I could almost see the memories rearranging themselves inside his mind. Every dinner, every holiday, every ignored phone call, recontextualized. That's the dangerous thing about truth. Once it arrives, old moments stop looking innocent. Vanessa stepped forward carefully. "Diane," she said softly. Not Mom, not Diane Whitmore, just Diane. Trying to sound intimate suddenly, human, but panic kept leaking through the edges of her voice. I looked up calmly. She attempted a smile. "We've obviously had some misunderstandings today." Misunderstandings. Interesting word choice for public humiliation. Nobody nearby moved. A waiter carrying champagne paused just long enough to hear her before continuing. Even staff understood something historic was happening socially. I folded the document closed carefully. I don't believe misunderstanding was the issue. Silence. Soft. Deadly. Vanessa blinked, her breathing quickened slightly. "We were trying to make the brunch comfortable for everyone. By seating me near the service hallway?" Another silence. Longer this time. A woman near the windows lowered her champagne glass slowly. Daniel rubbed his jaw with one hand. That gesture used to belong to Richard whenever he realized someone was lying to him. Seeing it on my son nearly broke my heart. Vanessa forced another laugh. "Oh my God, Diane, you're making it sound malicious." I tilted my head slightly. "You directed me toward the staff entrance." Simple truth. No drama. That's what made it impossible to escape. Around us, wealthy people had started pretending not to listen again, but nobody resumed real conversations. The ballroom still revolved around our table emotionally. Tyler approached Daniel quietly. "Dad." Daniel lifted one hand slightly without looking at him. Not rude, distracted. He couldn't stop staring at the paperwork, or me. I realized then that my son had never truly imagined his mother possessing authority outside motherhood. Not real authority, not institutional respect, not legacy. Widows become strangely invisible in America, especially older women. People assume your importance died with your husband. Vanessa was learning publicly how wrong that assumption could be.
Arthur gestured subtly toward the Founder's Terrace entrance. "If Mrs. Whitmore prefers privacy, we've prepared the terrace immediately." Prepared. Not available. Prepared. Meaning staff had already moved based on my comfort. The social meaning behind that nearly crushed Vanessa. I saw it happen. Tiny twitch near her mouth. Panic. Because upper-class humiliation works differently than ordinary embarrassment. It's not about screaming. It's about realizing everyone understands the hierarchy except you. One of the older members approached me again. Mr. Talbot, 80 if he was a day. Richard used to golf with him constantly. "Diane," he said warmly, taking my hand gently, "Richard always said Blackstone would still be bankrupt without you." Several nearby guests heard him clearly. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Just once. But I caught it. Another older woman joined us moments later. Then another. Suddenly, people who ignored me earlier were remembering stories, projects, fundraisers, expansion years. One man even laughed softly. "My God, Diane practically ran the East Wing renovation herself." Ran it. Not supported it. Not helped with it. Ran it. I watched Daniel absorb every word like someone discovering an entirely different version of his own family history. And honestly, part of me resented that it took public validation for him to see me clearly. But another part understood. Children rarely ask mothers who they were before motherhood. Vanessa stood slightly apart from the growing conversation now. Alone. Socially drifting. Nobody intentionally excluded her. That's what made it brutal. People simply turned toward me naturally. Toward history. Toward a priority. toward legitimacy, and she could feel herself losing oxygen in the room. Madison suddenly smiled at me softly. "I think it's amazing what you built." Built. That word mattered. I smiled back gently. "Thank you, sweetheart." Vanessa immediately inserted herself again. "Yes, well, obviously Diane's contributions were important. Were. Past tense. Interesting. But we should really get back to celebrating Tyler and Madison." Desperation now. Everyone heard it. Nobody rescued her. Daniel finally looked directly at his wife. "Why didn't you tell me she was seated in the back?" Vanessa froze. The question itself wasn't loud, but emotionally, it detonated. Because he didn't ask if, he asked why, meaning he already believed me. Vanessa straightened instantly. She said she was fine. I wasn't asked. I answered calmly before she could continue. Another silence. Daniel's face hardened further. That same terrible stillness Richard used to get before making final business decisions. Vanessa saw it too. Fear flashed across her face again. Not fear of me, fear of losing control over Daniel. And that's when I realized something important. Her humiliation wasn't really about the club anymore. It was about exposure. Masks falling. The polished version of herself cracking publicly in front of people whose approval she desperately needed.
Arthur leaned toward me quietly. "There's also the matter of sponsorship transfer." Vanessa's head snapped toward him instantly. God, that reaction alone told me everything. She already knew what mattered most. Not family, access, status, future standing. Daniel frowned. What sponsorship transfer? Arthur remained composed. The Whitmore executive designation controls future generational sponsorship approvals, meaning grandchildren, future spouses, private memberships, legacy access. The room understood immediately. Vanessa went pale, because suddenly this wasn't temporary embarrassment. This could follow her socially for years. I noticed Tyler watching his mother differently now too, confused, uneasy. That hurt me more than anything else. Children should never witness the collapse of parental respect publicly. But cruelty always forgets one thing. Eventually, witnesses grow up. Vanessa stepped closer to me carefully, lower voice now, private tone. "Can we talk alone for a minute?" Interesting. Not apology, negotiation. I looked at her calmly. "What would we discuss?" Her jaw tightened. "You know exactly what." I almost smiled, because yes, now I did. For years I thought Vanessa merely disliked me, but this was larger than dislike. She needed me diminished, needed me socially weak enough that future power passed naturally through her instead. And she thought widowhood had already done most of the work for her. Poor thing. She mistook grief for surrender. Daniel spoke quietly beside us. "Vanessa, no anger yet, just disappointment. But disappointment from good men can become devastatingly permanent." Vanessa looked toward him quickly. "I was trying to help your mother fit in today." The sentence was so absurd, several people nearby visibly reacted. One woman actually looked away to hide her expression. Fit in? Inside my own building? I finally laughed. Not loudly, softly, and somehow that hurt Vanessa more than anything else had. Because it wasn't bitter laughter. It was clarity. "I spent 30 years making sure this club survived economic collapse," I said gently. "I don't believe fitting in was ever my problem." Dead silence. Absolute silence. Even the jazz trio had stopped playing entirely now. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Tyler stared at the floor. And Vanessa looked like someone realizing the walls around her were disappearing one by one. Arthur stepped beside me again quietly. "The board is ready whenever you are, Mrs. Whitmore." Ready. Such a simple word. But suddenly everyone in that ballroom understood exactly what it meant. The decision belonged to me now. And judging by the fear spreading slowly across Vanessa's face, she knew it too. The ballroom felt colder now, not physically, emotionally. Like the temperature had dropped the moment everyone realized the ending of this morning no longer belonged to Vanessa. It belonged to me. Arthur stood quietly beside the windows, holding the final authorization folder against his chest. The board members waited near the terrace entrance. Even the staff seemed to move differently now, more carefully, respectfully. Across the ballroom, conversations had dissolved into low murmurs and unfinished whispers. Nobody wanted to leave,
because wealthy people love justice most when it arrives wearing pearls instead of rage. And Vanessa? She looked like someone trying to hold water inside trembling hands, barely together. Still beautiful, still polished, but cracking underneath. I remained calm. That part mattered, because anger would have made me look wounded. Calmness made her look guilty. Vanessa stepped toward me again, slowly this time, carefully. "Diane," she said softly, "I think this whole thing has gotten blown out of proportion." Blown out of proportion. Interesting phrase for public humiliation. I looked at her without answering immediately. That silence unsettled her more than words could. People underestimate silence, especially older women. When you spend decades swallowing hurt quietly, eventually silence becomes sharpened, intentional. Daniel stood nearby with one hand pressed against his mouth, still thinking, still unraveling emotionally. I realized then that today wasn't only exposing Vanessa, it was exposing his own failure to see me, and that realization was punishing him far more deeply than I ever could. Vanessa tried again. "You know I never meant to disrespect you." The room reacted subtly, tiny shifts, tiny expressions, because everyone there remembered the service entrance comment, the seating arrangement, the toast, the "still belong somewhere" line. Too many witnesses, too many details. Cruelty collapses fastest when multiple people watched it happen. I finally spoke softly. "You introduced me to your friends as though I was confused." Vanessa swallowed hard. I was joking. "No," I said calmly. "You were positioning me." That landed hard. I saw it hit several people at once, because the sentence exposed something ugly and recognizable. Social positioning. The quiet rearranging of power inside families. Vanessa's face flushed again. "You're twisting this." "No," Daniel said suddenly. His voice cut through the ballroom instantly. Everyone turned, even me, because there was something different in his tone now. Not passive, not distracted. Present. Finally present. He looked directly at his wife. "You did humiliate her." Vanessa froze. The words seemed to physically strike her. "Daniel, you seated my mother near the bathrooms. She said she was fine. You directed her toward the service hallway." Her eyes widened slightly. Panic now. Real panic. Because for the first time since I arrived, Daniel wasn't protecting her version of reality. He was protecting mine.
The silence afterward stretched beautifully, painfully. No music, no laughter, only crystal chandeliers glowing above people pretending not to stare, while staring at everything. Tyler stepped backward slowly beside Madison. Poor children. They looked like they'd accidentally walked into the middle of a war nobody warned them about. Vanessa's voice lowered sharply. "Can we please not do this here?" There it was. Not remorse. Containment. She still cared more about audience than damage. Daniel laughed softly then, but there was no humor in it. "You already did it here." That one stunned the room. Even Arthur glanced up, because Daniel finally understood something essential. Public humiliation cannot be undone privately. Vanessa looked at me desperately now, actually desperately, like someone realizing social gravity had fully reversed. "You know I care about family," she whispered. I almost pitied her then. Almost. But suddenly I remembered every lonely birthday dinner after Richard died, every ignored phone call, every holiday where I became decoration instead of family. And worst of all, I remembered how hard I worked to deserve crumbs of kindness from people I once sacrificed everything for. No, I was done shrinking. Arthur stepped closer quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "the board will honor whatever decision you make." Whatever decision. The sentence moved through the ballroom like electricity. Vanessa looked physically ill now, because suddenly everyone understood. This wasn't symbolic, this was real. Future memberships, invitations, private access, legacy standing, all of it connected to my signature. I glanced down at the authorization form again, one simple line waiting beneath my name. Renew executive family privileges. Approved, denied. Such clean words for something capable of destroying a person socially. Daniel looked at the document too, then at me, and for the first time since Richard died, my son looked protective of me. Not embarrassed by me, not burdened by me, protective. "Mom," he said quietly, "you don't owe anyone anything." That nearly broke me, because those were Richard's exact words. The same tone, the same certainty. For one devastating second, I heard my husband inside our son's voice again. Vanessa heard it too, and she knew. She knew emotionally she had lost Daniel in that moment. Not completely, not forever maybe, but enough. Enough to terrify her. She stepped closer quickly. "Daniel, don't do this." He didn't even look at her. Instead, he looked at me. I should have seen what was happening. Simple sentence, but honest. And honesty carries enormous weight after years of avoidance. I touched his hand gently. I let myself disappear too. That silence afterward felt different, softer, human, not humiliation anymore. Truth. But Vanessa couldn't survive inside truth, because truth removes performance, and performance had always been her greatest weapon. She turned toward the surrounding guests desperately. "This is insane," she laughed weakly. "We're talking about brunch seating like it's a federal crime." Nobody laughed. Not one person. A woman near the back actually looked embarrassed for her. That's when Vanessa truly understood. The room was gone. Socially gone. No allies. No momentum. No protection. Only witnesses. I picked up the pen slowly. The movement alone changed the atmosphere completely. You could feel people stop breathing again. Arthur stood perfectly still. The board members watched silently. Daniel's shoulders tightened. And Vanessa? Vanessa looked at that pen like it was a weapon. Funny. For years she mistook my kindness for weakness. Now she finally understood something women my age learned too late. Quiet people notice everything. I looked down at the authorization form one final time, then calmly drew a single line through Vanessa's renewal approval. Gasps. Actual gasps this time. Tiny, sharp, human. Vanessa stared at the page like she'd been slapped. "No," barely a whisper. Arthur accepted the paperwork immediately. Professional. Final. "Understood, Mrs. Whitmore." Vanessa stepped forward suddenly. "You can't do this." I met her eyes calmly. I already did. Dead silence. She looked toward Daniel desperately. Say something. But my son only stared at her with exhausted disappointment. And somehow, that hurt her more than losing Blackstone. Because she finally realized the real punishment wasn't the club. It was exposure. The entire ballroom had watched her reveal exactly who she was to an old woman she thought no longer mattered. I picked up my coat slowly, adjusted Richard's pearl earrings, then turned toward Tyler and Madison. "I hope your marriage is kinder than this morning was." Madison burst into tears immediately. Tyler looked shattered. And Vanessa? She looked completely alone. I walked toward the ballroom exit calmly while guests moved aside without thinking, respectfully, instinctively. And just before I reached the doors, I stopped. Not dramatically, quietly. Then I looked back at Vanessa one final time and said the one thing she would remember for the rest of her life. "You were so busy deciding whether I belonged here. You never stopped to ask who built the room you were standing in."